Writing a conclusion to your essay can feel like a high-stakes head-scratcher. You've done all this work to come up with an argument, lay it out in logical building blocks, and cite and analyze evidence carefully. What more can people possibly want from you? And what can you possibly be expected to add at this point other than, here's what I said, go read the preceding paragraphs and leave me alone? Although when we're first starting out, we're told that it's enough to just restate what we've said, in college and in actual good writing that people want to read out in the world, you'll notice that no one actually does that. We, your readers, have read what you've said, and you don't need to act like we've got amnesia.
If we talk for too long, I'm not going to remember this conversation.
My name is Lusia Zaitseva, and I'm the founder of IvyWrite.com. I also teach writing at Harvard University. And in today's video, we're diving into what it takes to write a good concluding paragraph at the college level, one that will leave a lasting impression on your reader rather than putting them to sleep. First, we'll talk about what not to do, then we'll talk about what you can do instead, and then I'll give you a few specific things you can try in your own writing and your own conclusions. So let's get started. First things first, the conclusion of an essay is not the same as the conclusion of a speech, debate, or other oral argument. People generally have a harder time following structure in spoken rather than written arguments, and so when you're speaking, it's great to tell your listeners what you're going to say, then say it, and then tell them what you've said. And that's why when someone presents an argument orally, you'll often hear explicit signposting like, in conclusion, or to sum up. But in an essay, we know you're concluding. We can see that there's not many paragraphs or lines left in what you've written. We'll look at some examples of what you can do instead in just a little bit. Number 2, it's easy to feel pressure in your conclusion to wrap everything up in a nice, tidy bow, no matter how complex your topic. But that's a really tall order and can lead to some truly grandiose and unfounded claims, kind of the correlate, if you will, of the things we talked about as pitfalls in the introductory paragraph video. In a good conclusion, you want to close without closing off, and remember that no one expects you to solve every last lingering mystery of the universe. Think of it this way. Human knowledge is a mountain made of individual grains of sand, and when we write in our own little ways, we add to that mountain. Or if you prefer, think of yourself as a ring in a long chain, with rings that come before and hopefully rings that come after. When a reader finishes your essay, they should want to go and write an essay of their own with your conclusion as their starting point, which means you should leave your reader with a sense that there's more to be discovered and more work to be done. You can close without closing off in a few concrete ways. You can show us what we can now see in a new light or understand better thanks to your great essay. You can tell us what you'd like readers to do now that they've read your argument, if you're presenting a normative claim about how something should be or if something is good or bad. You can frame what you've been talking about in a larger context, and you can circle back to some earlier assumption that we're now in a better position to rethink. You can also invite readers to build off of your essay in their own by showing us what new questions we can now raise based off of how far we've traveled thanks to your argument, by considering other possible applications of or approaches to your research, or by reframing a lingering question from earlier in your essay in light of the distance we've traveled. But how do you do that? You'll probably remember from literally any other video of mine, like the one linked here, that a good essay has to have stakes. No, not that kind. It has to have a reason for existing, and you, the writer, have to know and be able to articulate why what you're writing matters. So if you're doing it right, you're indicating your essay stakes in your introduction, and you have those same stakes to come back to and broaden in your conclusion. And you'll remember in that same video linked a moment ago that stakes exist in concentric circles, and in your conclusion, you can aim to get to a slightly broader sense of stakes than you had in your introduction. So let's take a look at an example from an essay titled Monet's Paradox, examining a theory about Impressionism put forth by the 19th century French writer Émile Zola in a painting by Claude Monet. For some context, here's the essay's thesis taken from the introduction. I want you to notice how sophisticated, arguable, and non-Liszt-like it is. Monet expands the boundaries of Zola's model of Impressionism to include not only the passive side of perception, the eyeballs soaking in light from a scene, but also the active side of perception, the artist carefully selecting a scene so that it will make a statement about his culture. Through Arrival of a Train, Monet delivers a powerful message about the cultural state of France during the Industrial Revolution. The composition of the painting, involving icons of French culture at the turn of the century, a train station and a cathedral, suggests that Monet deliberately composed it as a symbolic portrait, even though he may have tried to forget the implications of these mighty symbols while he painted the scene. As you'll notice, the stakes of this thesis have to do with the sources themselves. We have a better appreciation of Zola's theory in light of the way that Monet's painting challenges it, and it allows us to see how Monet's famous painting is much more than unfiltered impression. That's awesome. Now let's take a look at the way that this author expands his stakes in his beautiful conclusion, where he writes, Zola wants us to blind ourselves to the cultural implications in Monet's work. He says, let us take any painting and look for nothing more than what it contains, lighted objects, real creatures. For Zola, a painting should not be a vehicle for any ideas beyond the most basic perceptions of color and shape. But Arrival of a Train demonstrates that we need not limit Monet's role as a painter to that of a man without a brain, without ideas. As a key player in the culturally revolutionary era of 1870s France, Monet could not help but convey some of his sense of the world through his art. Gare Saint-Lazare, Arrival of a Train, captures his energetic, if apprehensive, view of the changes storming through France. It is ironic that although we may recognize the cultural weight of Monet's vision, he spent his entire career striving for the opposite ideal, to be Zola's perfectly virgin-eyed impressionist. In painting Arrival of a Train, Monet ultimately faced a paradox. He needed to capture the shallowest of impressions of what might have been, for him, the deepest of motifs. Notice how this writer isn't saying in conclusion, or just repeating what he already said in his introduction. Instead, he's doing what we talked about a moment ago. He's expanding his stakes from one painting by Monet to a broader discussion of Monet as an artist in general. And he's framing his analysis in the broader context of the time period and making a case for how one painting can really capture so much about an era filled with exciting changes. And by circling back to the idea that Monet actually would have liked to have been the kind of ideal impressionist that Zola posits, the author allows us to see what the paradox evoked by his title actually is. By coming back to the central key term of his argument, paradox, and helping us understand what is actually paradoxical, his conclusion also has a really nice sense of circularity. So now I think you're ready to try some of this for yourself. Grab a pen and take some notes. Try starting or ending your conclusion with an evocative or especially revealing quote from your source. In the conclusion we looked at a moment ago, you'll notice that the author chose a quote that really had some nice texture to it, that exemplified what it was that Zola was trying to say. And another thing you can do is bring in a quote from a different source, say from a biography about the writer that you're writing about. Here's an example from the end of a great essay about the Lolita trope in the music of Lana Del Rey. Elizabeth Grant gives us no choice but to embrace her Lana. Once we are able to pick the important messages from between the lines of her music, the rest is rust and stardust. In this case, the writer chose to bring in a particularly resonant quote from the author of Lolita himself, Vladimir Nabokov, and it's a poetic and memorable way to close. You can also try doing exactly what the author of the first conclusion does. Revisit a key term from your title that's central to your essay somehow, and help us better understand it. Of course, this might mean that you have to reconsider if the key terms of that title really indicate something about your argument, rather than just the topic. You can also try emulating his syntax for that all-important last sentence. Notice how the author uses a colon after the word paradox, and then gives us a really neat summation of what the paradox is. A third thing you can try is restating your thesis, but not just repeating it. You'll notice that the author of the first conclusion does that, and again, he doesn't just repeat what he said earlier. He fleshes it out, and in general helps us better understand his argument because he's able to talk about it with more detail at the end of his essay than he could have done at the beginning. And whatever you do, remember that it's your essay and you're in the driver's seat, so make sure you get the last word. And speaking of last words, some good general advice is not to try to write your conclusion before you've had a chance to live with your essay a little bit. Make sure all the body paragraphs are present, and if you can, step away from your essay for a few days. And yes, I realize that I'm telling you that it's not a good idea to try to write your essay in the 20 minutes you have before class time. When you give your writing and ideas the time they deserve, you'll very likely come to a new understanding of your argument and stakes without even actively thinking about them. That's because our brains have a way of problem solving for us even when we're not actively trying to. And if you can come back to your writing after some time, you'll have a better sense of what it was you were trying to accomplish. And that's it! Good luck with your writing, and I'll see you next time.